Hey guys, so we are going to be reading the story. It's chapter 4, and I hit a button. Okay. So before we read, we're going to go over vocabulary, and you should have this sheet right here. So the first vocabulary word is generation. Generation is a group of people born and living at the same time. Sacred is holy or deserves respect. Creation is the act of making something. Vast is large or great in size, amount, or extent. Nurture is to care for something or someone so that it or he flourishes. Rigid, stiff, and inflexible. Warp, to bend or twist out of shape. So I want to go back to rigid. We have been talking about prefixes. Prefixes with, you say, inflexible. Think about inflexible. And it goes along with stiff. So something's inflexible, that means it's not flexible. So the prefix in means not. So like I won't say irreversible, but that's IR. Okay, so that's your vocabulary. You need to hold on to it. I got to hold on to it because I have the pronunciation thing on here. And we're going to be reading Myths of the Maya. Myths of the Maya. Now, the very first thing I want you to look at on page 24, which is on the screen, is the big question. Now, the big question, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit. It's slow. Okay, so the big question for this chapter, chapter 4, is how does the sacred Maya myth explain the creation of the earth and its people? Big question. How does the sacred Maya myth explain the creation of the earth and its people? So as we read, I want you to think about that. How does the sacred Maya myth explain the creation of earth and its people? Now, let's talk about myths. What do you believe a myth is? We hear all the time different types of stories. You have your fairy tales, your realistic stories, you have myths, legends, fables. A myth is a story to help explain how or why things happened. One more time. A myth is a story to help explain how or why something happened. Myths are usually passed down from generation to generation. And it kind of seems like every generation adds something a little new to the story. So a myth is not something that we can prove. A myth is much like a theory in science. It it's a way to explain something, but we can't prove it 100%. So these are stories that were created by the Maya culture to help explain how and why different things happened. Okay? Now, this is their beliefs. So we're not going to knock their beliefs. Now, it may not be the same as yours, and that's fine. We're all good. But we need just to read and understand the myths of the Maya. So I'm going to zoom out so we can see the whole page. I think it was at 110. There we go. Let's do 110. Okay. So the myths of the Maya. Now, I may be looking up at your screen, but I also may be looking down in my book. It's easier for me to read from the book than the screen right now. So, and I don't want to put on my glasses. So, thousands of years ago, people around the world began telling stories to help explain how and why things happened. Some things, like the rising and setting of the sun, are predictable. Others, like floods and earthquakes, are often unpredictable. People created stories to make sense of both predictable and unpredictable events. Storytellers passed these symbolic stories or myths along from one generation to the next. Now, a lot of this is not just the Maya culture. You have the all the way back to like prehistoric times and the early hominids and all of them. You have the drawings that they did, and they are in some way worshiping some type of deity. What made it rain? They didn't know that weather. They didn't know how it worked. It just, one day it was sunny, the next the rain came along. So in their heads, rain could either be a punishment or it could be a good thing. It just depended. It just depended on the time. So people, they needed a reason why. Like a lot of us, when stuff happens, we need to know why or how did it happen. This was one way they explained it, was through the creation of these stories of these predictable and unpredictable events. So the creation of Earth and its people. Some of the best known Maya myths are recorded in the Pulpavu, or a sacred book of the Mayan. Even though the original book was destroyed, some people knew the stories by heart. They told and retold these stories through the ages. In the mid 1500s, these Maya wrote the stories down for future generations. Today, you will read a retelling of a combination of the combined creation myth taken from the Pulpaview, the creation of the earth, and the creation of the men of corn. Now, I do want to say that if I'm pronouncing these wrong, I do apologize, but I'm going by how it is phonetically pronounced. Pulpa view. View. Okay. All right, so we know what a myth is. We know that a myth is a story that's created and passed down through time to help explain something. And just to look at the picture on page 24, I see an older man telling a story to a group of younger people. How does this help us understand what the story meant by it's passed along from one generation to the other? How does this picture or this illustration help us see that? Well, you have the older gentleman who is one generation telling the story to a younger generation. And that's how it goes. That's how the myths go. And these kids, they hear these myths probably hundreds of times as they're growing up. And by the time they get to the age of the man in this photograph, one second, that's my boss. I'm sorry, when your boss calls, you gotta answer the phone. Okay, so these stories came from a book. And once again, if I mispronounce this, Popol Vuh. Now, they call this a sacred book. Why do you think they refer to it as a sacred book? Think about the word sacred. Sacred means that it's very close. It's very, I just want to blank on the definition. Holy. It's kind of like if a Christian, the Bible is sacred. If you were Jewish, it's the Torah. If you were of Middle Eastern descent, you're probably the um, I just went blank. Their book that's sacred to them, that they worship. So it's sacred to them because it holds all their stories. It holds the myths of how everything was created for the Maya culture. Now we're going to go to the next page. And as I turn, now some of these pictures in this story, it's more imaginative, I guess you would say, as compared to the stories that we have in the past. So, okay, look at the picture. Now, as I read, think about why they would choose this as the image. In the beginning of time, there was all was still and motionless. There was only sea and sky. It was hard to tell where the sea ended and the sky began. Darkness filled the vast emptiness. There was no earth, there was no mountains or streams. There were no animals or people. The gods of heaven then asked gods Tepu and Gukomont to help create a middle ground between the sea and sky. They agreed. Together, the three became known as creators and makers. So, what does this picture show? Well, it shows like at the beginning of the time it says there was only sea and sky. It's hard to tell from this image, and since the color is much better if you're looking at it a color, that you can't really tell the difference between where the ocean is ends and where the sky meets. So that's what this picture illustrates. So now we have been introduced to the gods of heaven as the gods Tepu and Gukomats to help make a middle ground. And this middle ground, it would be considered the earth. And I'm apologizing, I'm getting a drink of water. My throat is scratchy real quick. I'm sorry. All right, next page. Tepu and Gukomats thought hard about what to create and how to create it. Finally, they came up with a plan. Dressed in brilliant green and blue feathers, they shouted out the words to Earth. In an instant, Earth appeared. Part of the sea dried up and became land. Mountains rose up with valleys between their peaks. Then the gods added fresh water. Lakes pooled at the foothills of the mountains. Rivers flowed from one end of the land to the other. Trees and plants sprang up along the riverbanks. Though beautiful, Earth remained silent. It was too quiet. Tepu and Gokomont decided to add noisemakers. Suddenly, animals of every description filled the lands. Jaguars, pumas crouched in the jungle. Deer and antelope roamed in the plains. Snakes slithered along the grounds. Eagles and turkey vultures perched high in the trees. The animals screeching and roaring broke the silence. The gods were pleased. Praise us for creating you, the gods begged the animals. The animals just squawked, chattered, and howled in reply. Of what use are they? Tepu and Gukomont asked. The gods wanted creatures to respect and honor them, to praise them, to make their sacrifices to them. Because the animals were unable to do these things, the gods declared a new purpose for animals. Animals would be food for the people in the future. The next task was to create the people who would eat the food. So they get there, they shout, Earth is created. It's silent. They don't like the silent. So they create these animals. And all of a sudden, we have screeching and roaring. And it said it broke the silence. What does that mean, broke the silence? You can't break silence. But it can be silent, and all of a sudden you hear these screeching sounds. It breaks the silence. So that's what we call an idiom. Not an idiot, an idiom. I've had I've had past students think I say idiot, but I say idiom. Okay. Now, why he would use this idiom is because it emphasizes the fact that these animals' cries were like sounds of joy in a way that it broke. It was just silent. And as humans, sometimes silence is not good, sometimes it is. But it's very weird when it's silent. So these sounds broke this silence that was just like not good. So why did the gods refer to the animals and say, of what use are these? These animals, they squawk, they chatter, what else do? They howl. That's all they do. But They didn't chatter, howl, whatever, and praise the gods. And that's what they wanted. So, what good are you? I know what good you are. We're now that people want to eat you. So, they solved the problem of, hey, since you're not going to praise us, we're going to do this to you. So, that's why we have animals. We eat them. At least that's what the myth is about. So it's very colorful. You can see that these are images of the two gods. Very colorful with the blue and greens. And if you notice with a lot of Mesoamerican art, you have lots of vibrant blues, greens, oranges. And then we have animals down here. Okay, do I get it all? Yes, I do. Okay, first, Tepu and Kokomon made people from clay. The gods were pleased with how they looked, but the clay people weren't able to move. They did not lift their arms or bend their legs to walk. When the sun shone down on them, the clay people became soft and began to drip in the heat. When it rained, the mud rolled down their gooey figures. Their mouths became mushy, and it was difficult to understand their speech. They could not communicate and had no feelings. The gods decided to destroy these imperfect people. Next, Tepu and Kukumon fashioned people out of wood. Surely wooden people would be much sturdier than clay. They could honor and nurture the gods as the gods wished. At first, the wooden people seemed fine. They looked like humans and they talked like humans, and they began to have children. Their sons and daughters spread out throughout the mountains and the valleys. But these rigid people did not develop well physically. Their wooden bodies began to warp. Without flesh and blood, the people were uncoordinated. Worst of all, they could not think. Without any memory of their creation, they made no effort to honor the gods with gifts of thanks. What good, the gods wondered, are these non thinkers who wander aimlessly about the woods? Taipu and Gukomons decided that these wooden people too must be destroyed. Hmm. Okay. First, we have humans that are made of clay. And the gods thought these clay humans were, what did they say? Imperfect in their eyes. So, another prefix, imperfect, and M means not, so not perfect. Why? Well, if you look up here, it says the gods were pleased at how they looked, but the clay people were unable to move. They could not lift their arms or bend their legs. When the sun shone down, they became soft. When it rained, mud went down their faces. Their mouths became disformed and mushy, and they couldn't really understand what they were saying. It's kind of like that. So, they had no feelings. They couldn't praise the gods. So, we'll do away with them. Next, let's make some wooden people. All right? Now, the wooden people, they developed nicely. They had children, and those children spread throughout the mountains and the valleys. But they too were imperfect because they, right here, it said they could not think. Well, it's a tree. People are made out of woods. They couldn't think. Therefore, they had no memory. Then they had no memory to remember how they were created and who they needed to praise. So the gods were like, gone. Oops, sorry. Go back up. Very colorful picture, by the way. The gods unleashed boiling rain and mighty floodwaters to drown the wooden people. They turned everything else on earth against the wooden people, including their tools, tortilla griddles, and grinding stones. Cooking pots and water jugs rose up to attack them. Then they tried to escape. Roofs and tree branches collapsed on them. Animals threw them out of the caves. With no place to hide, the wooden people were soon defeated. It is said that a few did survive and that they live in the trees today. These creatures are called monkeys, resemble the people who who were first to walk the earth. Neither clay nor wooden people served the gods as they intended. So Tepu and Kokomon put their heads together once more. It was important to get it right on their third attempt. Third time's a charm, right? Third attempt. As they asked the Earth's animals for help, a wildcat, a coyote, a parrot, and a crow searched for the perfect place for humans to live. Now that's a group of people or things. A wildcat, a coyote, a parrot, and a crow. There, they also discovered abundance of spectacular yellow and white corn. The animals brought the corn back to Tepu and Gukomons. So, once again, it's very important that the guys get this right. They wanted to not have another mistake like they did with the clay or the wood. So, that's just how they did it. And so we have the wildcat, a coyote, there's your crow, and your parrot. And they find this place that has abundance of stuff. And one of the things they find is white and yellow corn. All right, so I guess now we're getting to the humans. Tepu and Gokomons decided to create humans from this new food crop. So, it was that the first men of corn came to be. Their flesh was made of corn kernels. The grain was ground with water and shaped their arms and legs of 4 men. They fed these men with the same plentiful crop in which they were made. These corn men seemed powerful indeed. They could hold on to things, move easily, and show feeling for one another. They could think, hear, speak, and see. In fact, their vision far surpassed the gods. They could see far into distant heavens and deep into the ocean depths. The cornmen praised the gods and thanked them for their remarkable gifts. Tepu and Gokomon's third attempt by creating people was a success. Finally, these earthly creatures were grateful to their makers. So, third time's a charm. Let's go ahead and read right here. It's very important that we read little things like this in stories. So, the powerful jaguar. As the top predator in the jungle, jaguars symbolize powerful beings. The gods wanted their new creations to be as powerful, so they named the first crop of men after the jaguar. So, why do you think the gods used corn for their third attempt? Why do you think? Well, remember when we went back, the wildcat, the coyote, the crow, and the parrot, they found a place that was plentiful with corn. So you have something plentiful, so they just chose that, and then they could also eat it. It's one of the main crops of the Maya culture. They refer to it as maize. Now, why do you think the narrator, which is me, used in the myth to show that the corn men were powerful like jaguars? Well, because jaguar itself is a very powerful being. And the gods said that the corn men seemed powerful indeed. They could hold things, easily move, and feel for other people. They could hear, think, see. Even their vision far surpassed even the gods themselves. So at the time, the jaguar in this area was one of the most powerful creatures. And in their eyes, they've created something that is equal to or even surpasses a jaguar. So let's get down here. Okay. But all not well. The corn men's sight was so good that the gods became jealous of them. The gods did not want to share supernatural powers with earthly beings. They wanted to make sure that the gods remained more powerful than the men on earth. So the gods decided to cloud the corn men's vision. They threw a mist over the corn men's eyes. Now the corn men would only see things nearby. By blocking their distant vision, the gods destroyed some of the corn men's wisdom and knowledge. When the corn men awoke the next day, they found corn women lying beside them. The gods had given them each a wife. Together, that with their wives, the corn people multiplied. In time, there were many nations of people. Some were light skinned, others were dark. The people formed different classes and spoke different languages. These multicultural people spread across the land and filled every corner of it with praise of the gods. Tepu and Gokomons thought back on their creation of Earth. They thought about the clay people. They thought about the wooden people. They thought about the corn people. On their third day, they had succeeded. They had created a world of thinking people who were grateful for their lives. The gods of heavens were pleased too. Now millions of creatures respected and honored the gods, praising them and making sacrifices to them. So, what words does the author use to suggest that the gods were pleased with their third attempt? Well, let's look. Let's see. It says third attempt, right? So let's see if we can find third attempt. Y'all may be finding it before me. It's on here, right? Page 30. Okay. All right here. On the third day, on the third try, they had succeeded, and they created a world of thinking people who were grateful for their lives. The gods of the heavens were pleased too. Now millions of creatures respected and honored the gods, praising them and making sacrifices to them. So the gods were happy with themselves. They were giving them a pat on the back. Look what we did. We created these corn men and women, and they now have multiplied and have a great nation of individuals who their sole purpose is to help and worship us. So we get praise. Now, that is the story of the myths of the Maya. So, pretty soon we will be posting the work for the day. So, I will get back with you. Thanks.